Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Effective Media Show. I'm your host, Henry, and today we're going to be talking about something real special to me. This IP is actually the inspiration for me starting my podcast to begin with. We're going to be covering Warhammer 40k for the first time on the show. Today's episode is actually going to be the first part in a many-part series discussing specifically Warhammer 40k in regard to the Horus heresy. So technically speaking, we're going to be covering Warhammer 30k. Now, just to clarify some things right out of the gate, the reason I was so intrigued and inclined to create this series on specifically the Horus heresy is actually two parts. For one, it's mainly going to be a blind review, reaction analysis to the Horus heresy in particular, with the context of what's happening in the Warhammer universe at large removed from it. So it's almost like a blind introductory for other people to get on board with who are interested in Warhammer, but they just want a more streamlined, clear way into it without having to have all this other knowledge front-loaded from Warhammer 40k at large to enjoy it. And part two basically comes down to my own personal preferences in regard to the Warhammer universe at large. While I do enjoy fantasy, sci-fi is definitely my flavor of fiction that I enjoy. I know that Warhammer has its fantasy element with the original Warhammer, Warhammer Age of Sigmar, Warhammer Total War, but that's not really my cup of tea, personally. And I guess as a third point, just to wrap everything up real concisely, I've always been interested in Warhammer 40k in particular, to the point where I was actually subscribed to Bricky and Adeptus Ridiculous and Eander and Coda. Within the Warhammer communities on social media at large, I would say that there's a distinct lack of blind reaction and analysis, and an oversaturation in the space of overarching meta-analysis and specific subject deconstruction. And while I do vibe with that kind of content, it's what initially hooked me into the universe. Whenever I wanted to delve deeper into it, be more committed to the hobby and the IP and the lore and everything, there's no real good middle ground between tidbit lore dumps and very nuanced meta-analysis where you have to already enjoy and be familiar with the entirety of the setting for you to even be able to keep up. And that's the specific middle ground I'm trying to achieve with the series on my show. But if I'm being really transparent with you guys, I'm a little bit disappointed in myself in that I didn't pull the trigger sooner. Believe me, I don't know if it's that I'm becoming more and more brain rotted as I use social media more, or if I just caught the content creator bug from being so invested with the franchise. But I distinctly remember being about 10 books in and thinking, man, there's nowhere that I can go that really will just review each book as they go through it, give me their own thoughts, things I could have missed, some kind of deeper insight that maybe if I just sat with that part of the book a little bit longer, I could have got to. And I just kind of shrugged off the thought oh yeah, why would I ever make a podcast? That shit is cringe. Then a couple months go by, and I still get that itch where I want that specific kind of media, and I just pull the trigger 20 books in, which is obviously a huge problem if you're doing a review and analysis show, because things get a little foggy, especially whenever they're books, right? So again, I'll just ask for a little bit of grace because I'm doing a review and analysis on old media that I don't really remember 100%, so I will be using third-party crutches like Lexicanum and the Warhammer 40k wiki and the fandom and all kinds of things like that, just to get the story beats and the plot points down. But there are specific things that as I start to refresh myself on how the books go, I do start recalling points in the book and things that happen where it really jumps out with me and it becomes just as vivid as when I was first reading about it. So the vision of the series isn't really going to become fully realized until we get about 20 books in, back to where I was. According to my Audible, and yes, I listen to the books, but I'm still going to say I read the books. I don't care what you say. You could say I'm misrepresenting myself. I don't care. But according to my Audible, the last book I finished was No Fear with the Ultramarines and Bobby G. But now that we're on the same page and we both have the same vision about how this is going to go and where it's going to take us, we could get into it. So we could start off with how I first got introduced to Warhammer and how I went about pursuing it, just so that you get an idea of what my journey has been. Funnily enough, my first exposure to Warhammer at large was Warhammer 40k, and it was when one of my buddies was reading the books way back in the day. Like, it had to have been 2008 or 2009. I think one of the original Horus Heresy trilogy novels had first released. I think he was reading Galaxy in Flames, if I remember correctly how the cover art looked. I'm not 100% sure, but I remember distinctly that it was the Sons of Horus or the Lunar Wolves or whatever, the gray Space Marine armor. That's what I remember. My buddy was like, hey, you should read this, it's pretty fire. I'll let you borrow the other books too, I think you'd really like it. But I was a bad friend and I didn't like reading, so I told him no thanks. But to be fair, I think I was either just going into high school or I might have still been in middle school, so I was not trying to read for fun. I was trying to play Call of Duty and go ride my bike. Well, as most people know, my buddy did get the Warhammer itch, so he started consuming the games, the other content. I remember playing the original Space Marine for the Xbox with him, although it might have been the 360, I'm not super sure. Then he further fell down the rabbit hole, so he got to playing the original Dawn of War. I don't know if you guys ever played it or if you remember it, but it was basically like one of those real-time tactical layer, strategic layer strategy games. I remember really enjoying that, and I stuck with it and with the genre for a little bit after that, so even way back when I wasn't fully committed to the IP, the aesthetic and the vibes were good enough that it kept me coming back off of the recommendation of my buddy. I think Warhammer, I mean, I'm not going to put it on a pedestal and say it's intrinsically different than other media or IPs, but especially with Warhammer, I think you either vibe with it right off the jump or it's so over the top and ridiculous that it just kind of shits the bed for you. But for 10 years, I would say for a good 10 years after that, I didn't come back to Warhammer at all. I didn't hear about it. No one I knew was talking about it. It remained a very niche thing until, I would probably say, like 4 years ago. At this point, like 4 years ago is when it felt like more people were talking about Warhammer. Yeah, it felt like everyone came out of lockdown with their new niche hobby, and I feel like a bunch of people kind of started gravitating towards long-form niche content like D&D, tabletops in general, obscure like fiction that you wouldn't ordinarily come into contact with because you're so busy doing other things. Maybe I got this all wrong in my head, but it feels like at that time we got the first news about the Space Marine 2 game that was coming out. Then shortly following that, I think Henry Cavill came out as liking Warhammer. Maybe he did way before, but I think it was around that time that he also announced that he's going to be producing a Warhammer show too. I think that's still in the works. I don't know. I don't really keep up with news like that, or rather I should say pop news. All this to say, I think I had a pretty typical journey in being exposed into Warhammer, almost in line with, I guess you could say, the normie exposure rate. And it was mainly during this hype phase of about 4 or 5 years that I started to become more invested in the IP and the franchise at large. Getting recommended videos by Luton, Bricky, Adeptus Ridiculous, and kind of just falling into it that way. Keeping it real casual for the next couple years until last year, I decided to get into the books proper. And boy, let me tell you, these are some good fucking books. They've got everything going on. Philosophy, theology, betrayal, trust, loyalty, all that good shit. It's a drama of the highest order, and I'm all here for it. The only other piece of media that I remember consuming that was at this scale and had this kind of fleshed out characterization was probably Legends of the Galactic Heroes. It's an older anime, but it's a fucking classic, dude. Shout out to Legends of the Galactic Heroes. Okay, buckle up, guys, because this is where the rubber meets the road, and we're gonna start really getting into this shit proper. For my own sanity, we are only going to be covering one book at a time. I had the initial thought that, yeah, I'll just do all three at the jump. I'm actually future Henry interjecting to past Henry, and that's not possible. So you know what? We're only doing book 1, Horus Rising. Back to past Henry. But before we get into the books proper, I need to give you just a broad understanding of the Warhammer verse as it pertains to the Horus heresy, because that's the whole thing, right? I'm going to take you through the journey just like I did. I'm going to give you the bare minimum pertinent information that you need so that way it's just not a bunch of nonsense. The broad strokes of the Warhammer 40k verse as it pertains to the Horus heresy are as follows. Humanity is on a quest to retake the galaxy after having fallen from grace and having a previously established galactic empire that had technology far beyond anything that they have currently. The previous galactic empire and the age of prosperity that they enjoyed was known as the Age of Technology. Once humanity established itself on the galactic stage as the most technologically advanced and sophisticated civilization, they made a bit of an oopsie-daisy and created what is speculated within the lore to be like true AI, and eventually technology ended up betraying them, leading in part to the downfall of the galactic human civilization. The other major factor was a series of what are known as warp storms within the Empire of Man. Just to go over the warp and the immaterium very briefly, you can consider the warp and the immaterium to be the opposite side of the same coin in regard to real space or the materium. Sorry for all the fancy words, but that's a part of the Warhammer verse that I personally really enjoy. Everything's kind of just a Latin derivative, and it really spices things up. So just remember these terms. They sound fancy, they sound good, it should be pretty easy to do. Getting back to the materium-immaterium relationship. To travel the vast distances required in the materium, humanity utilizes warp engines that travel through the immaterium. If you're familiar at all with sci-fi logic and tropes, just think of them as wormhole engines or Rosenbridge engines or whatever you want to think of it like that. You're basically tunneling through the immaterium or the warp to travel a vast distance and appear out of an exit in real space or the materium elsewhere. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the technological revolution was only half the reason for humanity's downfall. The other half can be chalked up to these warp storm irregularities that made basically traveling at all in the Milky Way almost impossible to do, cutting off supply lines to colonies and other planets, basically crippling the human empire because of how complex it has gotten. Everyone knows that the more technologically advanced a society or civilization gets, the more interdependent and complex it becomes, thereby robbing a bunch of the planets of the necessities to survive. So not only do you have planets that could barely function, but you also have all of technology revolting against you. And this would be a good point to bring up the mystical, or you could say the defining element of the warp at large. The warp also seems to work as some kind of psychic or emotional battery for all of sentient life in the galaxy at large. So you can view the downfall of humanity as a somewhat interconnected manifold of emerging problems. With the increase in human population and sentient life, perhaps you could say the warp was overcharged with emotion and unstable inherently because of it. Or perhaps it was the increased activity of the war that caused so much warp travel that would actually create the instability itself. Or perhaps it was a combination of all the factors we've talked about. Either way, ultimately the situation led to the downfall of the galactic human civilization and entered them into a new era known in-universe as the Age of Strife. Now, just as a rough timeline so that we get an idea of the timescale we're working with here, humanity enjoyed its prosperity during the Age of Technology, which lasted roughly from 15,000 to 25,000 AD. And the Age of Strife occurred from 25,000 to roughly 30,000 AD. So it took 5,000 years of war, suffering, famine, demonic invasion. We'll talk about that, believe me, but demons are real in this universe. And during that 5,000 years, eventually humanity does wipe out the emerging hostile AI race. But amidst the chaos of isolation, lack of communication, and the inability to travel, humanity on the cradle of its species on Earth can only assume that they are all that's left, and the situation and planet are deteriorating rapidly. Over those 5,000 years, without galactic trade and specialized materials, technology has essentially regressed back to our time, if they're lucky. And as everyone knows, you use it or you lose it, so they're gradually falling back further and further with virtually no hope in sight, leading to tribalism, fiefdom, and general instability. It's after these 5,000 years of regression and instability that a hero emerges. He's kind of the protagonist, he's kind of a big deal. I mean, he could be a god depending on who you ask. It's Big E, the one, the only Emperor of Mankind. This is a very special fella. Physically, he's like 8 feet tall or some shit. He's got glowing amber eyes, so he's like Super Saiyaned up all the time. And he's got this literal aura around him, almost like the old Judeo-Christian paintings you would see of like Christ and holy figures. He's got like real aura. He's also noted to be a perpetual, which in universe just means that he's functionally immortal, like his telomeres won't shrink. He won't die of old age is what I'm trying to say. He also has psychic powers like psychokinetic, telekinetic, all that shit. Some might even proclaim that he's the best psyker, but, you know, we're not going to get into all that right now. This is the very bare bones framework we need to work off of the first 3 books from. Well, this Emperor of Mankind is going to do the impossible, basically. He's going to unite the Earth and retake their place as the #1 species on the galactic stage. Obviously, there's a bunch of politicking and warfare and empire building that's going on, but we can leave that for later on in the series. All we really need to know are 2 things that help us orient ourselves in Warhammer 30k, aka the Horus Heresy. 1. In order to successfully launch a campaign against, I guess you could say, the entire galaxy, the Emperor decides he's going to need the best fighting force he could possibly create. The Emperor decides to take some of his own genetic code and modify it on such a detailed, highly sophisticated level that he essentially creates 20 sons, all imbued with different aspects of himself to a varying degree. While in universe and in lore, many will call the Emperor a god, they are what you would consider demigods. The Emperor himself refers to his children as the Primarchs. The Primarchs are essentially the Emperor's generals who are going to take over the entire galaxy. These Primarchs themselves will father their own legions of super soldiers referred to as Space Marines. And these Space Marines, much like their Primarch fathers, will inherit certain qualities and aspects from their father, their Primarch. So to wrap it all up, the Emperor is creating this unstoppable, completely organic fighting force led by his own children, his own sons, in hopes of completely avoiding any pitfalls that the previous galactic empire had. And 2. The Emperor of Mankind is the sole sovereign over all of humanity, regardless of where they are or what they consider themselves to be aligned to. If you're human, we welcome you with open arms. If you're Xenos, looks like today's your day to die, bitch. If you're a human breakaway civilization from the previous galactic empire and you're Xenos sympathetic or, Emperor forbid, Xenos allied, well, you have a couple days to literally reverse your whole culture and to get the entire civilization on your side, or we're gonna fucking bomb you and then take whoever's left, and it's ours now. To summarize, the Emperor of Mankind thinks that the galaxy is their birthright, and fuck all the other Xenos, fuck the Xenos sympathizers, and you need to get in line. So with this very bare, rudimentary framework of understanding that we have with Warhammer 40k now, I think we're finally ready to get into the 3 books proper. Alright guys, we're going to start off with book 1, titled Horus Rising. Already from the title, we have a little bit of context we got to provide, so we'll tackle that real quick. Horus Lupercal is one of the Emperor's children, one of the Primarchs. And real quick, I do want to just kind of put that into perspective, because in a universe like 40k where everything's so over the top and it's easy to get lost in the sauce with how crazy everything is, it's truly remarkable what a Primarch or even just a regular Space Marine is capable of. They are perpetuals, meaning they're functionally immortal, although not invulnerable. Their armor basically does make them invulnerable. They have superhuman regeneration properties, like they will just stop bleeding altogether after a couple of seconds. They have extra organ redundancy. They're completely made from the ground up to be the perfect war fighters. During this period of the Warhammer lore, the Empire of Man is undergoing what's known as the Great Crusade. It's the whole effort of uniting the galaxy once again, right? Well, during this period, it's thought to be completely impossible that a Primarch would ever fall in combat. I really want to drive home the idea that the Primarchs, above all else, right, above Space Marines and of course the regular guardsmen that make up a majority of the Empire of Man's, military, the Primarchs are just real demigods. Considering everything I just said, Horus Lupercal is actually the Emperor's favored son. And this is well known throughout the Primarchs because they are still family in a very rudimentary sense. They all have respect for each other. Some of the Primarchs get along better with other Primarchs. They're brothers, right? It's a brotherhood, and the Emperor is their father. Well, Horus is actually the favored son of the Emperor, and he's bestowed the title of War Master, effectively making him the voice of authority for the Emperor in his stead. With that little tangent aside, I'm really just trying to frame how important that the downfall of Horus is and why the Horus heresy is so beloved within Warhammer 40k. It's essentially a highly dramatized rendition of one of the oldest stories that humans have been telling each other, the son betraying the father. We begin Horus Rising 203 years after the Great Crusade has been initiated. Yes, you heard that right, 203 years, and all of these Primarchs and most of their original legions are still alive. So long as you're not slain in battle, you will basically live forever. And I think that's pretty good motivation for not dying in battle, you know? We're dropped into one of Horus's campaigns amongst the stars, a relatively fresh one too. This is only about a year after he's been dubbed War Master by the Emperor. He's currently residing on the Vengeful Spirit, his capital ship amongst the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet. Horus is currently negotiating with planet 6319, and there's a reason that it has that nomenclature. Once every expedition fleet is fully prepared and ready to mobilize for the Great Crusade, they're assigned a number, no surprise there, right? But the back end of that number is in regard to the planet or civilization they happen upon and try to bring under compliance. I hope now it's starting to set in how truly massive the scope and scale of the Warhammer 40k verse really is. We have 20 legions of Space Marines, each legion being hosted by probably more than 50 at least fleets. Each fleet being comprised of anywhere from a dozen ships, maybe up to 3 or more dozen ships, where one fleet will be enough to completely bring a multi-planet civilization down to its knees. Anyways, nerd glaze aside, back to Horus. Horus sends one of his best captains to go do the negotiations for peace talks with 6319. 6319 takes this opportunity to deliver a first strike on Horus's expedition fleet. The captain that Horus sends to the peace talks is named Sejanus, and he was the captain of the Fourth Company. The Fourth Company doesn't really hold any plot relevance, but Sejanus dying does directly affect one of the protagonists that we end up following during the first 3 books of the Horus Heresy. With compliance negotiation breaking down, Horus is left no choice but to completely subjugate these worlds. A campaign is launched on this small collection of planets, and they're dealt with pretty swiftly. I think the war in its entirety is over within like a month. During the war, we meet our protagonist for the first 3 books, Garviel Loken. Captain Loken and his company, along with 3 other companies, were assigned to spearhead the attack on the political leadership of 6319. Ironically enough, 6319 was also called the Empire of Man, and that particularly offended Horus. As a result, he basically assigned a massive amount of overkill to crushing the political head of the false empire. Following the successful completion of the mission, Loken receives recognition from the other 3 acting captains of the companies, which leads to him being invited to the inner circle of Horus Lupercal, an elite council and guard to the Primarch Horus, formerly known as the Mournival. However, the reason there's even an open slot in the Mournival to begin with is directly due to Sejanus' death at the hands of 6319. It's never really stated in the book if Horus chose to send his Mournival specifically to crush this, quote, false emperor as a way of avenging Sejanus, or if it was just a lucky happenstance, but Loken impresses Horus and the Mournival enough that they invite him in because he would be a good replacement for Sejanus. The Mournival itself is an interesting concept to talk about because it did have a direct role in Horus's backsliding into chaos and eventually turning on his father and causing the entire heresy. The Mournival is supposed to function as a dissenting, or at the bare minimum, objectionable voice to Horus on his campaign in the Great Crusade. You could think of the Mournival as a small little pocket democracy for Horus. Any major decision Horus is trying to pontificate, he has the Mournival to fall back on and to call for their advisement. The Mournival has been instrumental to Horus throughout the entirety of the Great Crusade. And this is where we could start to get into a little bit of speculation, because if the expectation is for the Mournival to give healthy, helpful criticism to Horus to a capacity and to a degree that no one else can, given especially his newfound title of War Master, the Mournival itself has to be balanced and healthy in its humors, perspective, and ultimately philosophy. You see, while Loken was ultimately decided in the end to be the replacement for Sejanus, there was a lot of discussion and debate as to whether or not he would be the right call amongst 2 members, namely Ezekiel Abaddon and Tarek Torgadon. Abaddon saw the death of Sejanus as an opportunity to reshape the Mournival, to repurpose it to better fit Horus's needs as the War Master, while Torgadon staunchly disagreed and wanted to preserve the Mournival as it was. Up to this point, the Mournival has always had members of varying dispositions and personalities to keep Horus advised in as honest a way as possible. However, with Horus having to shoulder much more responsibility as being the War Master and being effectively in charge of the Great Crusade at large, and in a much greater sense, his brothers as well, the other Primarchs, Abaddon felt that it would be time to better serve Horus. And it's this very schism that ends up growing and festering and becomes one of the main reasons for Horus's downfall that we'll discuss later on in the show. In the end, Loken is chosen instead of some other candidate, mainly because he has a similar disposition and outlook on life and what it means to be a Space Marine as Sejanus did. Sejanus was known wide throughout the Legion as an exemplary Space Marine. He was a man of the people, so to speak. very grounded in his ideals and virtues. Following the ceremony of induction for Loken into the Mournival, we get a better insight into Loken and why maybe they draw the conclusions of Sejanus and Loken in the first place. We follow Loken as he goes through, I guess you could say, a regular garrison day for a Space Marine. We see him do a little bit of armor maintenance and weapon maintenance in his quarters, while he's telling war stories to a remembrancer named Mercedes Olaton. Consider the remembrancers as active historians, with a minor in liberal arts. As the Space Marine legions travel through the stars on their great crusade, they're auxiliary to them insofar as they record what's happening and they create art for the Imperial Corps. Mercedes is typed as a documentarist. She's essentially a human iPhone in that she has implants in her brain that record what she sees, and she also has like genetic tweaking or something so that she has perfect recall. So what's essentially happening is Loken just talking to the camera for whoever's going to be seeing this later, like a fireside chat for what just happened on 6319. And it's during this fireside chat that we get to see the more sophisticated, thoughtful, multifaceted side of Loken that would make him seem to be the Sejanus type. He knows he's a soldier, and even further than that, he's a tool in that he was directly created for war specifically. But he can't help but feel and question certain things. He hasn't forsaken or abandoned his morality or his ethics, and it's really interesting to see. And just to drive the point home further, we also follow him as he makes his way to, I guess you could say, like a PR lecture, to put it simply. Another auxiliary mechanism for the Great Crusade are the iterators. Once a planet has been made to comply, once compliance is complete, whether it's through violence and conquest or through peaceful diplomatic relations, the iterators make landfall and they get to work. They start spinning up propaganda and they sweet talk you so good you don't even realize it's propaganda. But these aren't your run-of-the-mill journalists or politicians. These are like people who have spent their entire lives in training where this is their only functionality in the Imperium. Like, you're going to talk good and you're going to make people want to join our cause. Even things down to the most basic level, like your voice tone or your registry or anything like that, they will surgically change it, they'll genetically change it, they'll do all kinds of shit to make sure that you have the most convincing, persuasive, irresistible voice you can have. Just another example about how 40k just is so over the top, but god damn it if I love it. But yeah, we just see Loken kind of creeping on one of the lectures that they're having, and he's actually really good friends with one of the top iterators. His name is Kirill Sinderman, and he's basically been teaching Loken about history, philosophy, all kinds of stuff that, I mean, in a reasonable sense, no living weapon should be knowing about, you know? Most other Space Marines are either training 24/7 or they're doing like warrior monk-esque rituals because, you know, I guess that's just what they do. So we get this feeling, and I think Sinderman even outright states that the reason he believes that Loken was chose for the Mournival is because he's still very much in contact with his humanity. And honestly, that's a fair point. Just to name off a couple crazy things that Space Marines can do, they could go weeks without eating while still performing like at maximum output on the battlefield. They can gain memories from the things that they eat if they choose to. And they literally have like gear shifts in their metabolism that they could basically more or less turn on and off depending on an emotional state that they can reach, essentially nullifying any kind of poison or toxin. And that's not to mention their actual physical endurance, strength, all that. So you could see how it would be pretty easy for a normal person to live for a couple hundred years, facing down unimaginable monstrosities all throughout the galaxy, enduring mental conditioning that's bordering on brainwashing, to completely lose touch with their humanity. It makes sense why Torgadon wanted to maintain some kind of moral integrity within the Mournival, because while the Primarchs are demigods, they are not gods. They are still mortal in a very real sense, and they are still fallible. and we get to see more of that in the next part of the story. Now that 6319 is in compliance, Horus decides to call an all-hands meeting for most of the fleet leadership on his bridge. And it's during this time that we get to see Loken first interact with the politics of both the Mournival and the higher echelon of leadership directly serving under Horus, and Horus himself. One of my favorite things about this part of the story is how conscientious Horus Lupercal is about the way people perceive him, the way he interacts with people, and how they interact with the social, cultural, and traditional norms that he's established within his legion at large. Just as a quick example, whenever you first enter the bridge and the holographic planning area of the bridge, it's like its own separate thing, which already shows that it has a higher intrinsic value as opposed to the working bridge area. Not only that, but the holographic planning area is seated in a way where it's like Colosseum seating. You have the closest circle of seating nearest to Horus Lupercal. Then as you go up and out, it's more of the, I guess you could say, frontline commanders. Like nearest to Horus are the conceptual idea commanders who've been in for a long time. Then as you go further out, the closer you get to actual combat. And completely removed from this whole dynamic are the Mournival in their own orbiting circle of seating outside of the whole apparatus itself. And this is just the visual aspect of Horus's traditions and, I guess you could say, cultural standards that he's imbibed inside of his legion. Being superhuman and having a very good memory and recall, he's also able to personally know almost all of his legionnaires. So depending on where in the Imperium you've been recruited out of, more than likely it's going to be Chthonia, Horus's home planet. He will make an effort to specifically code switch in a very literal way where he's using your specific Chthonian accent to become more personable with you. And depending on the part of the seating ceremony or who he's addressing and their relation to his legion specifically, he'll code switch even further into a high form of Gothic or a low form of Gothic, Gothic being the Imperial Standard language. So hopefully you're understanding and you're grabbing a hold of the bigger picture here that Horus himself is very Machiavellian, scheming, maximalist, all these different ways we can phrase him, but he's ultimately interested in extracting the most value possible out of whoever he's dealing with, which could be the reason why the Emperor decided to choose Horus to be War Master, but that's all speculation for now. So while all of this is taking place and it's all brand new to Loken, what he essentially gleams from all this is that Horus is much more capable and much more motivated and ambitious than he ever gave him credit for. And eventually by the end of the proceedings, he's able to deduce, along with Abaddon just outright confirming his hypothesis and suspicion, that the Mournival essentially functions as an easy valve release for the political tension and vying ideas for how to properly get a newly compliant world on track. Essentially, the Mournival just functions in this capacity as an impartial observer who chimes in whenever things need to be favored one way or another. However, as we're going to discuss later on in the show, we do see the Mournival function in a much more confidential, advisory capacity. The Mournival truly are Horus's best men that he trusts to get real opinion, validation, and assurance from. All that withstanding, ultimately the meeting concludes with the generals and the intel advisors all coming into agreement that there's only one place that 6319 truly has a foothold of resistance in. It's a holy site, or rather a sacred site, known locally as the Whispering Heads. In reality, it's just a series of mountain ranges that vaguely resemble heads, but the whispering part is very interesting to the story, and we'll get there, don't worry. For brevity, continuity, and efficiency's sake, we won't cover exactly what the whispering aspect of the Whispering Heads is yet, because it deals with a larger aspect of the Warhammer 40k verse at large. For now, all we really care about is that it's been agreed upon at the highest level by even Horus himself that if you want to crush the resistance on 6319 in all aspects, militarily, spiritually, culturally, you must take the Whispering Heads. Speaking about political theater and showmanship in regards to the Mournival, I think this is a good place to bring up Rogol Dorn, one of Horus's brothers and fellow Primarchs. So, Rogol Dorn is actually a part of the fleet at the moment just because their campaigns happen to intersect. That in of itself is not too unusual in the Warhammerverse, especially during the Horus Heresy era. However, what he mentions to Loken directly following the meeting is what I would like to talk about. Like we discussed earlier with Horus's ambition and desire to maximize value from his subordinates, it's at this point where Rogol Dorn is talking to Loken that we really get it confirmed from the source. Loken confides in Dorn that the planning operations stage of the fleet action isn't what he thought it would be. And the fact that one of the auxiliary functions of the Mournival is to essentially steer the campaigning and the attitudes and ideals of the highest echelon of the fleet command is concerning to Loken. Dorn then goes on to educate Loken about how each of the Primarchs inherited a certain aspect of the Emperor. And amongst all the other Primarchs, with Dorn included, they've all concluded that Horus has essentially inherited the Emperor's grand ambition. Dorn then goes on to state how there are other Primarchs who are better candidates to be War Master and in charge of the Great Crusade. Dorn then goes on to speculate further that perhaps the Emperor is looking for that ambitious drive in his War Master, not necessarily the efficacy of someone's warring. With this exchange having taken place, Dorn feels even more comfortable letting Loken know that while he was in the fleet readying to return to Terra, Earth as we know it, while Horus and the Mournival were considering who to add to the Mournival in place of Sejanus, Dorn actually lobbied heavily for him and basically convinced Horus to convince the Mournival to let him in, confirming outright what Iterator Cinderman was referring to earlier, that even in Dorn's eyes, even from a Primarch's perspective, he could see the writing on the wall and needs to assure that his brother is going to be balanced in his humors. That essentially, with Sejanus gone, the Mournival was at risk of becoming too bloodthirsty and driven purely from ambition. He even goes as far as to name Abaddon as the main antagonizing and corrupting influence on the Mournival. With Loken and Dorn's chat concluded, Rogol Dorn proceeds to his flagship and makes way for Terra, while Loken prepares his 10th company to take the Whispering Heads. Before we can thoroughly talk about the themes and ideas of the Whispering Heads, we actually need to discuss the Warp a little bit more. As we touched on earlier, the Warp is kind of an emotional battery, or the opposite side of the same coin in regard to the Materium and Immaterium relationship. To try to put it as concisely as possible, the Warp is essentially a paired universe with our own, or even a dimension you could say, but it's not governed by the same laws of physics or rationality or anything like that. It's stated to be purely chaotic, and unless you're a specifically trained and well-versed and gifted psyker, even just looking into this realm can cause total madness. And as we're going to see front and center in this part of the first book, it's actually home to otherworldly, outer dimensional demons, for a lack of better term. And we'll leave it there for now, and whenever we get to the truly chaotic part of the books, we'll talk about it more then. While deploying from orbit in their Thunderhawks, the 10th Company and Loken specifically get very weird Vox communications that they aren't sure what the cause is. Vox comms are just essentially radio transmissions, but it's Warhammer and it's gotta be cool, alright? So like voice box, Vox, yeah. Shit is lame, but it's also very cool, deal with it. But these Vox transmissions can't really be deciphered or triangulated or anything. Loken's communications officer in his Thunderhawk is like spazzing out big time that he can't figure out what's happening. But it appears to be more than just a failure of duty that's causing these emotions in the officer. It appears that the actual transmission itself and being exposed to it is causing some form of psychosis or insanity, and just bad vibes, like once you hear the Voxcom and you don't have the absolute steel resolution of a Space Marine, you immediately start tweaking. Loken eventually, after running all the Batman simulations in his head, decides it's probably just some kind of scare tactic, because the only thing they could really make out is a faint whisper of a name. So they're thinking it's probably some mythological hero, maybe it's just something creepy to get under the Space Marine skin, who knows. Essentially what you need to know is that Loken disregards it entirely and advises his communication officer to switch channels, do a bunch of jamming, all kinds of sci-fi mumbo-jumbo to keep it to a minimum. Completely unfazed by the transmission, 10th Company continues to blaze towards the Whispering Heads. And this is where we really get our first showcase and demonstration on why the Space Marines are just the best, period. By this point, it's been about a month, I believe, that 6319 has been technically in compliance, but the Whispering Heads has maintained the rebel stronghold on the planet. As a result of this, there are bodies and bodies, just so many Astra Militarum, the regular Imperial army, just littered all across this almost Himalayan-like mountain range. But the altitude, the cold, the conditions don't matter to a Space Marine, especially a Space Marine in their armor. Not only that, but as a staple in Warhammer 40k, where a majority of the books take place, it's pretty commonplace to have Terminator armor, but at this point in the Horus Heresy, it's a brand new tech, and all you need to know is that regular Space Marine armor already makes you almost invincible. Terminator armor basically makes you invincible. So we just get a great image of the surviving garrison of Imperial Guardsmen who are supposed to be making sure that the rebels don't take more ground, just kind of like a trench warfare stalemate. We see these guardsmen just struggling to stand up and breathe and keep watch, gaze upon these Space Marine superhumans just walking at the enemy, shrugging off stubber fire, artillery, just casually walking at him like it's no big deal. We're gonna take the mountain, buddy. It's so fantastic. Just the indomitable will of mankind made manifest in superhumans in almost the most advanced armor in the galaxy that we know of. So eventually the 10th Company take the mountain structure and the subsequent subterranean cave system hideout kind of a thing. And it's not a big deal for the Space Marines. Like, these guys didn't even really have technology and weaponry that could harm them. It's just more of an issue of flushing all the rats out and making sure the resistance is stamped out. But because of the nature of the mission, in that they have to investigate the entire cave system so thoroughly, it results in them being exposed to a bunch of occult shit and what we would eventually come to know as chaos. And I guess this would be a good place to just briefly touch on what chaos is without completely showing my hand, because the whole reason I want to give you this drip feed of information as we go is mainly because I want to put you in the same headspace that I was in as I was discovering the lore, the backstory, the world building, all that great shit that makes Warhammer so fantastic. So chaos is essentially the conscious, malevolent manifestation of the warp at large. It's like I've been harping on, the warp is the emotional battery of the materium, of the material real world. And another way you could look at it is that it's where your dreams and your beliefs and your manifestation are made reality. To put it simply, if enough people believe something, over time, the culmination of that group of people's beliefs, if the boundary between the materium and the immaterium is thin enough or eroded away through occult ritual or whatever else, eventually that belief, that feeling, that deity that you're trying to birth will eventually become a reality. And that new creation from that reality is known as chaos. So you could see how parsing between chaos and talking about the warp or the immaterium is difficult to do without the full picture. They're kind of married together in a causal kind of way. Getting back to the story with Loken and 10th Company though, after successfully clearing both the mountain structure and the subterranean cave system, one of Loken's sergeants is exposed to too much occult shit and chaotic energy, and as a result gets corrupted and possessed by this chaotic entity known as Samus, the same Samus that they heard the name of on their way down from orbit in the Thunderhawks. And it's very interesting the way it happens, because you would think that anyone is susceptible to chaotic corruption and possession, right? And for the most part, you'd be right. Most regular people, like even just the Imperial Guardsmen outside, if they came in and they were exposed to even, I would say, like 20% of what this sergeant was, they for sure are falling to chaos. However, we're talking about Space Marines who have been alive for centuries, possibly, on the extended range at this point in the lore. So their constitution and their resolve for the Imperial truth, which is a whole other thing, but we could talk about that in a bit, would ordinarily not be affected by chaos, or at least this exposure of chaos. We find out later that he actually was harboring a bit of resentment towards another one of his battle brothers for getting promoted over him, and he probably lapsed on his meditations and his, I guess you could say, conviction or study to the Codex Astartes. It's basically like their big Bible field manual for what you do in virtually any situation, but that's got other lore too. To sum it all up, basically this Space Marine fell to what we would consider, especially in Warhammer 40k, to be a very minimum exposure to chaos, mainly because he just wasn't as resolved as he ordinarily would be. And this is the part where Warhammer 40k gets to be Warhammer 40k. You basically get a souped up demon fighting a future sci-fi knight in full battle plate, and it's fucking good. It's so good. I can't do it justice because it's written so well and the stakes are so high, but I mean, if it's the first time you've ever seen demonic possession through chaotic forces, Loken is fucking shook. He's on the back foot from the jump. It's very well done. The sergeant in question, once he's possessed, wipes out his whole squad. And he's beating the brakes off Loken. Like, he's doing everything. He's fighting for his life, basically. It's not a fair fight, because chaos in our material realm, if you're an immaterium being in the materium, you fundamentally work off of different logic. Like, it's not the same thing. He's shooting him with this fucking rocket launcher gun, basically. He's not doing anything. It's just regenerating. He's cutting him up with his power sword, which is like a lightsaber, but cooler, not doing anything. Samus is taunting Loken. It's looking bad for him. It's only through the miracle of another squad finding them dueling in this chamber area and lighting him up all together with 8 bolters at once. And that, I mean, that shit is ridiculous that that's what it took for him to go down. Like, it atomized him in such a way that even with the irrationality of the warp backing him, it was enough to fizzle out the possession. And if you don't know, a bolter is just the standard issue weapon a Space Marine will use. If you try to use it as a person, it's like shooting a 50 cal, but with more kick. It's not meant for you. It's meant for the Space Marines. That's all you gotta know. So it's a big fucking gun that hurts a lot and basically kills everything, which is why it's so impressive that it took 8 of them all continuously firing in tandem to kill this thing. And I'd also like to add, as far as I know, this is the first time that the Lunar Wolves, Horus's Legion of Space Marines, has directly encountered chaos, period. So, good job, Loken. You've slain a warp-spawned monstrosity from another world. Or I guess it'd be more accurate to say you survived your encounter with it. You would have been fucking toast if that other squad didn't show up. But what's worse than having your first encounter with chaos and not even knowing that it's chaos? Having the remembrancers see it, record it, and then act like they didn't see it, so they're just sitting on this giant fucking secret that no one knows they know. I'm sure that won't be a problem in the future. So this is all very unusual, yeah? You have an actual warp-born entity making contact into the material world, the Materium. It just so happened to be with the newest member of the Mournival, the one that's supposed to symbolize humanity and grace above all else. And he's also the only survivor who saw the possession happen. Well, little Horus Aximand does not like this situation at all. He basically tells Loken to buck up, kiddo, and this shit isn't a big deal, and how dare you kill one of our battle brothers regardless of how disgusting and laughable of a parody they are to humanity anymore. And he basically threatens him to keep quiet about it because it'd be bad for morale and, this, that, and the third, trying to give him the whole runaround. But it's like I said, this whole situation is so unusual, and the only people privy with any knowledge of chaos, even in the briefest regard, like in a need-to-know basis kind of way, are the Primarchs. So with how unusual this whole situation is, in the middle of little Horus bullying Loken, trying to get him to be silent about what happened, in comes Horus, hot as hell, like, hey, back the fuck up, how dare you? This isn't what the Mournival's about. And while he's berating little Horus Aximand, he goes so far as to give special concern as to how one of my sons can act this way. And I'd like to take a moment to just talk about that and unpack it and how it relates to the overall Warhammer 40k verse, but also just dive into how this interaction can be geared towards Horus's advantage. As I mentioned before, the Primarchs are inheritors of certain aspects of the Emperor, right? Well, it's the same thing for Primarchs and their Legionnaires, their Space Marines. And this inheritability goes all the way down to their physical looks in some cases. The reason why little Horus Aximand is called Little Horus is because he's the splitting image of Horus himself, just about 3 feet shorter and a lot less bulky. And I'm not sure if it's the same way in other legions, but Horus has developed this culture and this social faux pas about looking like your Primarch. Those who inherit the visage of Horus are held in high regard within the Legion as having the most of his essence within him. Whether or not that's true is completely up for interpretation on the whole inheritability versus genetic argument, right? But the real cultural aspect of that has been bred into the Legion. Like, Loken himself does not look a lot like Horus, and for that reason, as a reason, the Mournival, namely Abaddon and Little Horus Aximand, were against bringing him in because they thought he would be too different or not essentially like Horus. And this whole cultural attitude towards having the visage of Horus begs the question, is this something Horus actually values? Does he have any inherent values in himself? Or is this just another control mechanism that he's developed to help guide his legion the way he wants to? It almost becomes like a free hall pass to discriminate, other, and ostracize those Space Marines they don't agree with if by chance they happen to not look like Horus. But anyways, speculation aside, after Horus tells little Horus to go fuck off, being privy to this need-to-know information by the Emperor himself, Horus gives the rundown to Loken essentially in the same way that we just did, right? He explained what the warp is, what chaos is. However, where Horus differs in his opinion as to whether or not they're actually demons, he just classifies them under the umbrella of Xenos. Because Horus himself believes and upholds the imperial truth above all else. That being that there's no such thing as gods, there's no such thing as demons, science is the highest ideal, and mankind are the rightful heirs of the stars. That is essentially what the Imperium of Man is functioning off of. That is their dogmatic essence given voice, made form, if you will, by the Emperor of Mankind, no less. Armed with this new knowledge, and reinforced by Horus's emphasis on the need to keep it on a need-to-know basis, Loken has a bit of reprieve and his resolve is restored. However, he can't shake this nagging feeling that it's something more than what science can describe. He saw this thing basically defy all logics of this reality in the way that it regenerated, mutated, just really flaunted itself in the face of basic reason. It's this seed of uncertainty that's going to really blossom into the culmination of Loken's character later on in the books. And that concludes part 1 of Horus Rising, The Deceived. Moving on to part 2 of Horus Rising, we have Brotherhood in Spiderland. Look, alright, I'll give it to you, the name is a little goofy, but it's my favorite part of the book, clearly because I'm a junkie for good action. Brotherhood in Spiderland starts off proper with Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, receiving a distress call from another Space Marine chapter in the local sector. The chapter's name are the Blood Angels, and it's exactly how it sounds. They're a bunch of pretty boy space future vampires. Don't at me. They're actually a community favorite. A lot of people have a soft spot for the Blood Angels, and they actually have a really interesting narrative and thematic element to them in the Horus Heresy at large, but we could get to that when we get to that. What I find interesting about the chapter of Blood Angels in particular is that every Space Marine Legion, for the most part, has some baked-in weakness or flaw that's just a part of them. I don't know if it was intentional from the Emperor. There's a lot of conspiracy within the fandom and the lore at large for that, but it's too early for me to really make a solid claim on that. After all, I'm only like 20 books in or something. But the Blood Angels have this weird, innate desire to just eat stuff. Like, there are other chapters who are known for being aggressive or problematic, to say the least, but the Blood Angels have this proclivity towards blood. They really, really just want it. They like it. They love it. And that's a problem whenever you're hacking and slashing with an energy sword or a chain sword or any of the crazy shit that they have in Warhammer. Oftentimes, if a Space Marine is faced with enough opposition or even just an adequate challenge that requires immense effort on the part of the Space Marine, will oftentimes just drench them in blood. Like, it's very often depicted and described in the books after a Space Marine has gone through even an initial skirmish on a compliance campaign to just be literally drenched in blood. And the Blood Angels have to restrain themselves almost constantly. And like I said, there are other Space Marine chapters who have this characteristic to them, but the Blood Angels are considered noble. Like, that's their aspect that other Space Marines collectively like view the chapter as having. Like, they're very noble warriors because they don't ever give into it. Like, it's talked about if you go on a campaign with another Space Marine Legion, if there's a particularly difficult world to bring to compliance, you're going to be campaigning with another Legion for possibly months, maybe even years, depending on the opposition. And in that amount of time, of course, battle brothers are going to form bonds that are almost incomprehensible aside from maybe a few grizzled Imperial Guardsmen. As a result of that, word gets around that, hey man, you were looking kind of weird in that fight. Like, you had a crazy look in your eye, and I'm a fucking space wolf, so what's that about? And then they'll of course, eventually over time, word will get out. And so they're known as noble because they never ever cave to it. And I think that's a pretty fucking cool thing. And while we're gushing about the Blood Angels real quick, just so we get invested in the Legion, so we understand them more and we could relate to their plight a bit in this upcoming part, I'd like to briefly talk about Sanguinius, the Blood Angels Primarch. That's his whole name, Sanguinius. He's got no two names about him because he's just that great, to be honest. And while Horus has the reputation of being ambitious amongst his Primarch brothers, Sanguinius is known for being very earnest, honest, and just graceful, I guess. I mean, he's described as being handsome, even beautiful at times, but the title of being the prettiest Primarch does not go to Sanguinius, unfortunately. But above all these aspects, his true trait that he inherited from the Emperor is his soul. It's hard to quantify exactly what the other Primarchs are really referring to when they describe him as inheriting the Emperor's soul, but I think we could get a better grasp of it if we compare him to Horus and how we've seen him interact with his commanding officers, his auxiliaries, and ultimately his legion. While Horus has this absolute ambition to complete the Emperor's great crusade across the galaxy, it's that goal itself that creates these machinations and processes for manipulation and coercion that ultimately embodies his ambition. However, with Sanguinius, the way he interacts with his Space Marines and his auxiliaries, and the way we see him interact with Horus himself later on in the book, lead me to believe that he's being very earnest in his care for his Space Marines. I'm not going to say anything outlandish like Horus doesn't really view his Space Marines as his sons or anything, but I think if you read the books or you listen to them or however you consume the media, you will immediately get this distinct delineation between the two and just feel the difference. I would like to posit that it's that caring nature, that distinct paternal instinct that he has, that is what he truly inherited from the Emperor. So now that we're hopefully a little bit more invested in the Blood Angels and what is going on with them even, we can jump back to Loken, Horus, and the gang on the Vengeful Spirit. Some time passes after Rogal Dorn and his Imperial Fists part with the fleet, when, like I said earlier, the Vengeful Spirit receives a distress call from a local Blood Angels element that's on another planet right now. And the reason I want to make the distinction that it's an element and not even, I would say, an army, or perhaps maybe it's a company. I can't really remember the details, but it's an unusually small fighting force to bring compliance to a world. And the Blood Angels fucked up because this Xenos race is not playing around. So you might be asking yourself, what monstrosity can stop a Space Marine in full battle plate, angry as a motherfucker, ready to take your shit? Well, the short answer is big fucking spiders. Look, guys, I know I'm popping off and I'm cursing a lot, but this part of the book is really good. I really like it, and I'm just excited to talk about it. And I want you guys to feel that energy too. These mega arachnids, as they're designated by Horus later on in this part of the book, regularly stand, not hunched up on their hind legs, ready to fuck you up or anything. A little bit bigger than the average Space Marine. Like, you know, when you're standing next to a cow and you're like, damn, if this cow could stand up, it would be crazy big. Well, these are big spiders that just stand regularly bigger than a Space Marine. To be that big, they are also extremely armored, because, you know, spiders have an exoskeleton. Well, these guys have a crazy tough carapace. They could withstand bolter fire to a degree. You know, if you concentrate enough fire on them, they'll blow apart. But if they catch you on a one-on-one, your bolter is basically just going to be a parry device. And remember, like we said before, a bolter is basically like a mini RPG that if you tried to shoot, even as like a yacked up Imperial Guardsman, you're going to break your arms. Not only that, but the Blood Angels describe them as being incredibly fast enough to speed blitz you if you are not really prepared. Like, if they ambush you through the crazy, weird Xenos vegetation on their fucked up world, you're gonna get got. Like, unless you're really ready at every moment, they're just too fast. They're too fast, and they have crazy claws. Like, their arms are basically swords, and they have 4 of them to attack you with. Luckily, the Blood Angels have an affinity towards melee weapons and fighting with their power swords, so they've kind of got an advantage. Like, if another legion had rolled up, like if a ranged affinity legion rolled up, they would have got fucking rolled. They would have rolled up and got rolled up. These mega arachnids are really no joke. After the world has been brought into compliance later on in this part of the book, Horus himself dubs this planet to be named Murder. I know, very over the top, very gauche, but that's Warhammer for you. So now that we have an understanding of why the Blood Angels are there, who they're fighting, how dire their straits are, I think now would be a good time to go over the character moments and the story beats as they unfold. En route to the planet that will soon be called Murder, Loken, feeling responsible for Sergeant Jubal's death, the Space Marine sergeant who ended up falling to chaos in Part 1, takes it upon himself to go and do the rites of removal, or whatever they call it. He's basically going to go take his gear, give it to the armorer, go through all of his belongings. Even though they're like space warrior monks, they don't really have a lot of things, but you can have some things. Loken, being the captain of his chapter, sees it as his responsibility to really take special care to remember Jubal and really go through his belongings and remember him for the man that he used to be. I suspect as some form of trauma coping, or as a way to process his grief. While he's removing the possessions and taking inventory of Jubal's gear inside of his room, Loken takes notice of some things that are clearly prohibited and that Jubal shouldn't have, period. While every Space Marine Legion has their own doctrine or way of waging a compliance campaign or anything like that, The Lunar Wolves, Horus Lupercal's Legion, the War Master's Legion, strictly prohibits you to keep any war trophies at all. That especially goes for xenotech, because that's not made by humans. What are you doing? Are you a heretic? But it also reaches to cultural artifacts or relics, or especially things of spiritual significance to the culture you just conquered. And Jubal has quite the stash of trophies that he's acquired over his 100 or so odd years of campaigning, one of which appears to be distinctly of spiritual or religious value. It appears to be a talisman, like maybe something hanging off of one of the weapons that he stole it off of, who knows. This gets Loken to thinking, because he is a thinking man after all, that perhaps there's some kind of connection between religiosity, being spiritually open, and being corrupted by chaos, which I can say confidently with only 20 books of experience and my vague understanding of the overarching lore of the universe does have some validity. While being religious or being spiritually open or having even an agnostic view about a higher power or anything like that doesn't mean that you'll immediately fall to chaos, or that you will even fall to chaos if you're exposed to it. But it's almost like having a doorbell on your house. Like, the doorbell is made to be used. Like, it makes it easier for whatever's outside to get in. Not only that, but he finds another piece of paraphernalia that is absolutely prohibited. He finds a Warrior Lodge coin, or a token, or like memorabilia, I guess. The very short reason as to why this isn't allowed is because Horus believes that secrecy breeds malcontent and distrust inherently, and that if there's some kind of secret club that only certain people are allowed into within the Legion itself, it's going to create an underlying power struggle and a weird dynamic that you're essentially inhabiting two worlds, a public world and a private world. And that's not good for cooperation and achieving a greater goal like the Crusade. Even if you tried to call Horus on some hypocrisy here, having formed the Mournival isn't operating in secrecy. Sure, you could say that the selection process for the Mournival candidates is done in private, but it's not exactly the same thing as having a secret underground network of different people interacting with different companies in a way that shouldn't be happening. Is this just a hang-up of Horus's inherent manipulation and organizing the Legion in a way that he could control better? I mean, that's up for you to decide, but I think it's pretty on brand for him. Loken, being very obviously distraught over this, doesn't really have anyone he could talk to aside from his second in command. Narratively, this guy doesn't really do anything. He's more of like a soundboard for Loken's ethical considerations and own moral quandary later on in the books, but we'll just name him for the sake of it, just in case he comes up again. His name is Nero Vipus, and I think he's pretty handy with the toolie, I think. I don't know. I think he's a good shot. That's all I really remember about this guy. Well, it turns out Nero is also a part of the Warrior Lodge, and he pitches it to Loken as it being a good thing. And Loken, having no choice but to trust him, takes Nero at his word and decides to go speak to the Mournival about this. After all, it's their job to counsel Horus on what they think is best for the Legion alongside him. To Loken's chagrin, it turns out that they're completely aware of the Warrior Lodge, and they're all members. This obviously makes Loken spiral harder. He just lost one of his best sergeants to chaos. His second in command has been a part of this Warrior Lodge, so you could say he's ideologically adjacent to Jubal since they're both members. And now he's found out that the most highly regarded individuals within the Legion are also aware of it, but not only that, they're probably prominent members as well. And surprisingly, out of all the Mournival members to invite Loken to the lodge, little Horus Aximand decides to be the one to extend the invitation, which I found to be a fascinating choice because he was also the one to break the news of chaos to him as well. If you imagine the Mournival as a gradient spectrum of being lawful good to chaotic neutral in like the traditional tabletop sense, it's almost like Torgadon and little Horus Aximand are right at the middle of the gradient, but they're just a couple steps away from each other in either direction, with Torgadon being more of a neutral good and little Horus Aximand being a bit more of a chaotic good, with Abaddon being the chaotic neutral and Loken firmly anchoring himself in the lawful good side. So like little Horus said, whenever the next lodge meeting rolls around, he makes sure to meet Loken, and they do a little Tom Cruise Mission Impossible stealthing through the ship to go to the secret location. Upon arriving at the meeting, Loken doesn't really know what to think. For the first time, he's been stun-locked effectively, which makes sense. Loken is like the moral grounding for the Mournival. I would say, in a non-biased way, he is the most, educated on morality and history because of his relationship with Carol Sinderman, the chief iterator that he gets a little bit of schooling from. So for the first time in a very long time, he's confronted with a true moral dilemma. On the one hand, he's been told by Horus, his Primarch, that these lodges are bad and that we shouldn't have them. They can only lead to and facilitate bad things happening in the Legion. But on the other hand, he's speaking to Torgadon and a bunch of other Space Marine brothers he would never be talking to ordinarily, and everyone's having a good time. It's very wholesome. It's very by the book almost. Like there's still this underlying system of respect and honor amongst them. And I suppose Torgadon put it correctly, or the most correctly, I guess I could say, in that he just views it as a fraternity. They are very literally battle brothers, but in this space, rank doesn't mean anything. Your section doesn't mean anything. You could just talk to someone as a human being, which is something Loken really does resonate with because he takes pride. Maybe pride's not the right word, but he does appreciate the fact that he's still so in touch with his own humanity. So to see so many of his legionnaires also trying to hold on to their humanity, it very much goes in conflict with what he thought he knew fundamentally about the Lodge. And to take it another step further, he's also starting to view Horus Lupercal, his Primarch commander, with a little bit more fallibility and to view him with a bit more scrutiny, I would even say. This is one of those key moments that really sow the seeds for the schism that occurs later on in the Mournival. Eventually, Loken asserts himself against Torgadon's position that the Warrior Lodge is a harmless fraternity. He doesn't take a hard stance and proclaim it to be a true evil that needs to be rooted out because he can see the value in it. He's effectively been won over, but very reluctantly. Loken asserts that it is still inherently wrong because it's being done in secret, and that is one thing I want you to keep in mind about Loken. Because in one way, it kind of does reaffirm what I said earlier about him questioning the Primarch. He's no longer asserting that it's wrong because Horus Lupercal says it's wrong. He's asserting that it's wrong because it feels wrong to him. The wrongness, though, we could say, just hasn't crossed the threshold to become a true schism in the Mournival. However, this answer does satisfy Torgadon and Little Horus, who's also kind of creeping on the conversation. He's not directly involved with it, but he's in the area and he could probably hear what Loken's saying. Following the Warrior Lodge meeting, Loken decides to seek out the advice of Carol Sinderman, the iterator friend of his. Loken eventually discovers Carol Sinderman in the vast libraries of the Vengeful Spirit. While Loken himself didn't tell Carol Sinderman directly about what happened on 6319, I have to suppose that, off the record, not mentioned by the book, Mercedes Olaton, or perhaps WH40k, or one of the other remembrancers who saw the actual demon transformation and the chaos breach mentioned it to him because he's a smart guy. I don't know, but he somehow figured out, because the ship talks, I guess, about the chaos. My bad if I forgot to bring that up earlier in part 1, because the demon transformation and possession was just so forefront in my mind, but there were a group of remembrancers who were brought down to the surface because that's their whole job, right? They view what's going on in the Crusade and then they make art according to their profession for the Imperial Corps. And WH40k and Mercedes Olaton definitely saw what was going on. Anyways, sidebar explanation aside, Loken happens upon Carol Sinderman in the library researching demons, and this is how you know chaos is very slow going and nefarious in its corruption of individuals, because Carol Sinderman has been researching this for probably a couple weeks now at this point, but he's already noticeably gaunt. And this is a man with fortified constitution because he believes in the imperial truth, first and foremost, but he's also just like quick on his feet. He's an old fucking guy, like really old. He's like in his hundreds or something. And all he does is debate. Like he's unironically a debate lord. So from like a layman's perspective, like in my opinion, it would be really hard to corrupt Carol Sinderman because, like I said, he's smart, he's wise, and he's also educated too. Knowledge is power after all. So the fact that it's just eating him, literally, like, I don't know, it's fucking weird chaos magic. Like, it's probably actually consuming his soul in some regard. I just mainly wanted to bring this part of the book up to highlight the effects that chaos has on people. I find it to be really interesting that just knowing about it, it becomes like a cognito hazard for your psyche, kind of like with the Rocco's basilisk thought experiment in philosophy. It's just interesting is all. Following visiting Carol Sinderman and getting a brief rundown of the history of demons, at least from what they have of their very old books that they probably view as being like inherently steeped in superstition and tradition and bad faith sourcing, just because of the inherent attitude towards mysticism in the Imperium, given the imperial truth. Loken heads back to his quarters to really try to process everything that's happened to him, because it seems like in the book all of this happened over like the course of a couple days. He's greeted by Mercedes Allerton, his remembrancer he's assigned to, the human iPhone we talked about earlier, and they have a little moment of humanity together, you know, greetings, salutations, that kind of a thing. But the main reason Mercedes is here is because she wants Loken to sponsor one of her remembrancer friends. All we really need to know about Mercedes' remembrancer friend is that he was censored by another legionnaire. We don't really know who, it's not important, for trying to speak the true, unabashed truth without all this imperial truth dressing and propaganda on top of it. It's this action that also goes on to further cement himself apart from the Mournival, with some exception towards Torgadon. Remember, Loken doesn't like secrecy, and this is like the ultimate test of secrecy. Is he going to allow the truth to be completely silenced? Just because, I don't know, some other Lieutenant Space Marine in another company didn't like the way it sounded? And ultimately, Loken is saving this guy's life. When Mercedes is asking him to sponsor him, she's basically asking Loken to take ownership of his life on the ship. He was basically going to be ejected, not literally, but he was going to be sent back to Terra, to Holy Terra, what we know as Earth. So Loken is just going through it right now. Not only does he know he's heading for a very grim battlefield that is really challenging Space Marines, but he's also going through a lot of personal transformation, taking on more responsibility, being a part of the Mournival, and also just helping out his remembrancer friends, because Loken takes some degree of pride in his humanity. These remembrancer friends are also tethering him to his humanity further. But the trouble ain't done rollin' for ol' Loken. Mercedes Allerton also mentions to Loken how she and WH40k saw the weird demonic thing, and how WH40k is kind of crashing out because of it. She's moved into the lower decks with the Imperial Guardsmen, she's drinking a lot, she's fucking a lot, and this isn't like her at all. Like, she's a very high-minded, classy lady, so, you know, she's being a good friend. Taking it back to Loken's perspective, not only has he just discovered that they are also in on this secret, along with Carol Sinderman somehow, he still hasn't figured that out, but one of the people, namely WH40k, is crashing out so hard that she's now a liability to keeping the secret under wraps. So Loken, doing his due diligence, decides to take a trip to the lower decks with all of the unsavory guardsmen. He eventually finds WH40k, and they have a little bit of a heart-to-heart. She is really going through it. She's like, look at it. She's pulling it up from her camera, her future camera. She pulls out like the memory crystal and then plugs it into like a holographic TV. It's all very sci-fi and cool, don't get me wrong, but she does all that, and she's like, look at it. It looks fucking weird. It's not pixelation. I'm a fucking photographer. I know what's going on. This is weird. When I I was looking at it, it's like I wasn't looking at it. She's fucking crashing out. She's drinking while she's talking about it. It's crazy. All very dramatic, very Warhammer. I love it. But the main thing I want to impress upon you is the fact that WH40k is having such a different reaction to it than Mercedes Olatin. And I think this ultimately comes down to their differences in the way that they interface with reality in of itself. A bit of a stretch, but bear with me. So we know Mercedes Olatin, first off, she's like one with her technology. She is the iPhone. Her head is shaped weird. She's got implants. Like, she is very dystopian sci-fi punk. And Mercedes is like what you would imagine like someone would think the ideal future is. Like, yeah, it's literally the best camera. It doesn't need to be a part of you. Why would you want it to be a part of you? So the point I'm trying to get across is that Mercedes Olatin has her technology as a part of her. She interfaces with reality, seeing it in a very objective way. Now, did she subjectively see it differently than WH40k? We'll never really know that, but I think the perception of the thing, the qualia, we could say, if we're going to be really philosophical about it, the qualia of the encounter with chaos, I think inherently affected them differently. Is there just a different confidence that Mercedes Olatin has because she can just kind of zone out and then relive it exactly the way it happened? Is there an assuredness to her, like a stronger conviction because of the person she is in a very physical, literal sense? Could it be the external and unreliable nature of WH40k's interaction with it through her technology that could have fucked with her in a different way? Or is this all just boiling down to qualia, personality, lived experience, just being two different people? Maybe chaos directly targeted WH40k, and I think there's merit to that, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Ultimately, the point I want to make is that these are two very similar people who interface with media and technology in a similar way, having very different reactions to it. One of them having conviction and being able to easily cope and get over with this, while the other one is seeking comfort and relief in any vice she could think of. Is she even really consciously seeking a vice, or is it just subconscious trauma from the interaction and exposure to chaos and her just trying to forget it? After WH40k has her meltdown and Loken looks on in horror because he's realizing, man, if she crashes out any harder, I'm gonna have to fucking kill this bitch. WH40 has a moment of lucidity and clarity that she recognizes on Loken's face without him saying it, that, man, I need to shut the fuck up. This dude, this is a secret. I can tell this is a secret. And she just gives him the picture or the pictograph or whatever the fuck they call it in Warhammer. They give each other a knowing glance like, okay, well, that happened, but no one else is going to know about it. And whenever Loken leaves, we see perhaps the reason why I mentioned that chaos targeted her. She's worshiping the Emperor as a deity. Like, she has a shrine to him. She's praying to him. There's like hymns and shit. This is an underground movement of the common people, the low goths, right? Like, because in Warhammer, they speak Gothic, and there's High Gothic and Low Gothic, and there's a whole history behind that. But what I'm saying is, like, the common folk, the engineers on the ship, the non-military personnel, like all the meat in the Imperium that keeps the gears turning. Well, those common folk have started worshiping the Emperor on the low. And if you remember the Imperial truth, there is no such thing as religion, deities, mysticism, spirituality, none of that shit. And this just further begs the question, okay, well, how spiritual was she? Was she always open-minded? Was there some kind of element to perhaps she was more attuned to being targeted by chaos? Perhaps that's why she got the brunt of it and Mercedes Olatin's okay. There's tons of questions about this. It's all very fascinating, and we could kind of wrap it up in a nice bow later whenever we're talking about what happens later on in the books, because it's very fascinating. WH40k is very important in that part. But moving back to the part of the story at hand. It's around this time, maybe a couple days have passed, but the Vengeful Spirit and its supporting fleet have arrived at the planet known as Murder. It's at this point that Horus and his fleet discover that there's two distinct ship types and fleets in orbit. one belonging to the aforementioned Blood Angels, but the other ships seem to belong to an even smaller fleet of Emperor's Children. Now, when I say Emperor's Children, I'm not referring to the Primarchs or even the Space Marines or humanity at large. The Emperor's Children are actually another Legio Astartes, another Space Marine Legion. We won't bother talking about their Primarch right now, because I feel like he deserves his own intro whenever he becomes relevant in these upcoming books. However, I do want to just talk briefly about their inherited aspect from their Primarch, like what thing about the Emperor they inherited. And the Emperor's Children have a bit of nuance to them that I think most people gloss over just because of how one-dimensional it could seem to be at first glance. The Emperor's Children, and especially Fulgrim, have inherited the drive towards perfection. And I know what you're thinking, oh, this all sounds like semantics. Is there even any grounding in the lore for all this? Well, there is, and I've gotten to some of it, but it's really all that I have to go on from what I have read so far in the books. And I know what you're thinking. How can the drive for perfection be any different than ambition? It sounds like you're just trying to weave complexity out of nothing, but it is inherently different. Ambition is just the desire to get what you want at any means necessary in Horus's case. While perfection, if we're going to get philosophical about it, is arguably never attainable. So you're constantly chasing something that you can't really have. In one sense, the drive for perfection is an even stronger motivator than ambition itself. However, chasing something that you'll never achieve is probably going to leave you more susceptible to suggestion, manipulation, and ultimately the embodiment of evil chaos. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So upon learning this, Horus is already a little bit confused because he's only been responding to a Blood Angel's distress call. So already you can tell that the situation is very dire if it's an all-hands distress call. Not only that, but Horus hasn't received an Emperor's Children distress call, so they must have just arrived on the scene. And to make matters worse, Horus notices these weird light satellites. They're just giant satellites that fly around the planet Murder with like varying degrees of light activation of different colors, and there's like harmonics happening. There's a bunch of sci-fi mumbo-jumbo, but for whatever reason, the scientists aboard the Vengeful Spirit believe it to be some kind of communications array, and they're trying to decode what's going on, but they're failing miserably. So you have the pressing issue of the Blood Angels most likely being very nearly annihilated, the Emperor's Children showing up unannounced, not really trying to communicate what's going on, so that's kind of weird. And then you also have these mystery satellites that, is it a weapon system? Is it a broadcasting system? All these things are still real possibilities whenever your only guess is that it's some kind of, quote, communications array. And the real cherry on top is that it appears Planet Murder is just inhospitable, if not consciously, actively hostile. Horus and his science team go on to note that these weird magnetic storms that are completely blanketing the planet appear to be moving in an organic kind of a way. But I know what you're saying. Like, aren't magnetic storms and thunderstorms just inherently organic? They occur naturally in nature, right? And you'd be correct on that front, but they appear to be moving in ways that can't possibly be natural phenomena. Like the patterns of the storms, the way they're covering certain parts of the planet, it's almost like they're providing literal cover from orbital entry. Not only that, but a byproduct of these storms is that it's completely blocking Vox communication. So now you're dealing with the issue of not having any idea of what you're dropping into, and the drop itself even done in the safest way possible via Stormbird, which is like the biggest, strongest air transport craft that they have. Eventually, Horus, along with the help of the Mournival, come to the conclusion that they could sit here twiddling their thumbs, trying to find the most effective, safe way to get into the fight, or they could say fuck it and just drop like Space Marines. They just say fuck it, but they do it in the best way they can. They use orbital drop pods instead of risking their Thunderbirds or any other entry aircraft they might be using. I can't recall exactly how much of his fleet he committed to the first orbital drop, but Horus gives the green light and they get to dropping. And the world Murder is called Murder for a reason. It appears that the vegetation has evolved in such a way that it's either at the bare minimum completely at odds with regular animal life on the planet, or is symbiotically linked to it, where if something dies on it, it begins to eat it, kind of like a Venus flytrap, and then it produces fruit. I don't know, it's weird fucked up shit on this world. The blades of grass are literally like blades. The Astartes make note of it that, like, hey, if guardsmen were walking through this, like, they would get cut to ribbons. Like, this is fucked up. It also appears that the vegetation perhaps has some kind of like hive mind consciousness that is connected to itself, and it's working maybe not as like a targeted evolution, but it's working to adapt itself to the megarachnids. So not only is the first impression of the planet to be inherently hostile towards most life, you know, like this is a weird fucked up closed terrarium of murder. If you're some kind of extraterrestrial, regardless of whether you're of human proclivity or xeno proclivity, if you land here, you're probably going to get fucked up by this planet. And if you're dumb enough to land here, you're probably not going to get out because of the magnetic storms and thunderstorms and all the crazy weather that's happening. But you've also got to deal with the megarachnids who, like I mentioned earlier in the show, are big, fast, heavily armored, and just seemingly have no sense of self-preservation in the tactics that they employ to ambush and attack the Space Marines. Because here's the thing, if you're a good enough swordsman, like we'll see later on in this book, you can probably 1v1 a bunch of megarachnids pretty effectively back to back. But whenever the megarachnids are like, just have this weird hive mind subconscious understanding of like, I'm gonna fall on his blade, and when he can't get it out, you're gonna fucking chop him in half. It becomes almost impossible to fight them effectively how you've been trained to fight. So, like I said before in the show, the megarachnids really are giving them a run for their money. The Space Marines are taking losses, not in a 1-to-1, but in like a 0.5-to-1, and this whole fucking planet is infested with megarachnids, so they need to figure out how to stop the magnetic storms and get the rest of the Legion down here. After we're done spending time with Torgadin, Loken, and their companies as they're making planetfall, we move over to the Emperor's Children and we get introduced to their named Astartes. There are probably more than 3 named Astartes for the Emperor's Children that we follow throughout the books, but these are the 3 with the most plot impact and that I find the most interesting, so we're going to talk about them. First off, and probably the most important of the trio, is going to be named Eidolon. He's actually very OG in terms of Astartes. He was born back during the Unification Wars, and he was one of the first rounds of soldiers who fought in the Unification Wars that got elevated into the Astartes via like all the surgeries, the gene seed implants, all that shit. Eidolon's one of those characters who has an air of importance to himself that's much larger and inflated than what it really is. Being such a long-lived, long-standing veteran of the Legion, he does have a certain air of importance to him, but it's not nearly what he conflates it to be. He's kind of like the grandfathered legacy Emperor's Child Space Marine. Like, he does embody the essence of chasing perfection, but there's just something about his character where you almost get the idea that he thinks he is already just a little bit perfect. It's weird. I can't really describe it concisely, but if you read the books, you'll get what I'm saying. The last thing of importance I will say about him is that he is the Lord Commander. It's basically like the first company commander in the way that Abaddon is for Horus's Legion. They're basically top dog, but you gotta think, is it because he's such a veteran of the Legion, or is it because it's actually done off merit? He's one of those characters, right? He's like a Count Dooku type, if Count Dooku was more in the spotlight. Next up, we have Lucius. That's the only name we're really given for him, and the only characterization we're really given for him is that he's literally like the best swordsman ever. Like, the best, because you gotta keep in mind, right? The Emperor's Children as a legion prides itself in always being better, chasing perfection, right? So he's the best swordsman in the Legion, almost on par with Fulgrim himself, so he's very, very good with the sword. He alone is like credited as the reason why the Emperor's Children have even been able to survive this long. And last but not least, we have Saul Tarvitz. He's probably the most important thematically and plot-wise out of the three, and he's real cool. If I had to draw a comparison between someone we already know and kind of his whole vibe and like what he's characterized as, he's like the Emperor's Children version of Sejanus. He's highly respected and held in high regard within his legion just because he's such a great guy. In a legion that finds themselves pursuing accolades and recognition and a growth in reputation, all in pursuit of this so-called perfection, he decided to be the humble one and to take the job in the middle of the line that no one wanted to do. He's not chasing accolades or medals or recognition. All he wants is to keep his company, his part of the line, as well-trained, well-prepared, and well taken care of as possible. And with all three of them introduced, we can kick it back to the plot now. As I was saying earlier, the story leaves Loken, Torgadon, and all the rest of the Mournival with their companies and shows us what's going on with the Emperor's Children in particular. So we see Eidolon, Lucius, and Tarvitz with what remains of their element. It's hard to say how much force they came to murder with. Clearly less than the Blood Angels, and less than what some people would even consider being an adequate amount of force to take a well-fortified compliance world. Point is, they're on their last leg, and they don't have a lot of guys. I think they're intermixed with an element of the Blood Angels as well, so they have about a company's worth of men, maybe, and not a lot of ammo. Their swords are running out of power. Their chain swords are running out of gas. Things are looking dire. After a small skirmish with some of the Megarachnids, they break contact and notice a very big concrete-esque tree that has all these Space Marines impaled on it and is seemingly digesting them. It's very fucked up, very Warhammer. Love that shit. But what really catches Eidolon's eye is that it appears to be pumping out in like a chimney stack kind of a way, the magnetic storms that are taking place in the atmosphere. So the gears start turning, and Eidolon asks Lucius and Tarvitz, like, hey, do you think the trees are responsible for this? It appears to be eating our guys. Are the storms going to stop whenever all of us are eaten? What's going to happen with that? No one really knows, but eventually they just come to the conclusion that they're going to blow up the tree. They're going to use the last of their explosives. They're going to fucking duct tape all their crack grenades, frag grenades, the C4, everything they got, and they're just going to try to blow up this tree, mainly as like a fuck you and a last stand, because you got to keep in mind, right? This is a very big tree. If when you're impaled upon it, you make a Space Marine, which is like 8 to 9 feet tall, depending on the height of the Marine, in full battle armor, looking like they're just leaves on the tree. So for one, they don't even know if they have the explosives to take it down. And for two, someone or something is definitely going to show up mad as fuck if you knock it over, even if you don't knock it over, because the explosion's going to be so loud. So as a last vengeful act, they kind of just decide like, yeah, this is how it's going to go out. We're going to try to avenge all our brothers who are impaled on that tree and try to blow it up and just fight till the end. Honestly, mad respect. Don't really have much to criticize the Emperor's Children about there. It's honestly their best plan in reality, because even local Vox, like amongst the company that they have, like if you're at the front of the company on the patrol line and you're trying to talk to someone in the back of the patrol line, shit's not sounding great. Like maybe you might catch half of what they're saying. They're fighting with their helmets off because their Vox just locally is fucked. So there's no way to really coordinate any kind of planned, well-executed, sweep and clear mission, you know? So they execute, they end up toppling the tree. The tree does stop making gas or whatever the fuck. However, it's making the thunderstorms up ahead. However, it's just like we discussed, and basically every mega arachnid for like 2-3 miles around all lets out a shriek, and they know the jig is up. Like they're fucking, all of them are coming, at least for this little area. There's nothing you could do about it. Last stand time. So the Emperor's Children and the Blood Angels are doing their thing, you know, they're back to back, Hella crazy good fighting's going on. Great part of the book. If you're a fan of the action, this specific battle, skirmish, whatever you want to call it, is fantastic. This is the part of the book you're waiting for if you're like all about that Warhammer action. Like you saw a Luton video and you're like, damn, that's sick. I want to actually learn about that. This is your moment. I'm sorry to glaze this part of the book. I just really enjoy the action. It's half of the reason why I actually like Warhammer. So I just want to give this part of the book, this little battle, its flowers. It's very well done. If you're a fan of like fast-paced, melee-focused combat, if you like reading that kind of stuff, it's very well done. So they're fighting, and eventually the magnetic storm clears enough that comms start coming online randomly. More and more elements are showing up. It's becoming an all-out brawl for this specific part of murder. As more and more Mega-Arachnids show up, more and more Space Marine, different disparate elements that got separated during the entry of the planet start to coalesce, and it becomes a giant fucking brawl. And the tide of the war is slowly but surely shifting in this one battle, and we get to see it all unfold in real time. The book describes the Mega-Arachnid swarm as being a crashing wave that never ends. But as Voxcoms start to come online and coordination and planned intelligible battle tactics are being drawn up and executed, the Space Marines only continue to gain momentum throughout the battle, until eventually this endless wave of crashing Mega-Arachnids eventually break off and retreat. Now, the Space Marines don't give chase given how low on supplies, morale, and manpower they are. However, this battle, born out of the frustrated, vengeful spirit, no pun intended, of Eidolon, is actually the turning point of the war. Not only have they discovered how to dispel the magnetic storms that are plaguing the invasion force so hard, but they've also more or less completely consolidated the remaining Space Marine forces on the ground, effectively buying them a beachhead point with the storm already dissipating overhead to land even more Space Marine forces. And from this victory, a 6-month-long war is waged on murder against the Mega-Arachnids with the ultimate goal of extermination. Remember, the Imperium of Man is not a fan of Xenos. Maybe we can work with some of them if they're human enough and they're willing to be second-class citizens. And even then, that's a very big maybe. But these are giant spiders, more or less, who don't seem to have any intelligible expression at all, who only seem to be hellbent on consumption and perhaps escape off of this planet. It's not really known at this time. Eventually, during the 6-month campaign, Sanguinius, the Primarch of the Blood Angels Space Marine Legion, links up with Horus in orbit. And this is where we really get to see the humanity in the Primarch shine through and how they really do have no other equal except for another one of their brothers, another fellow Primarch. When Sanguinius and Horus meet on the flight deck, shortly after Sanguinius' fleet enters the same stable orbit as Horus's fleet. And their meeting is very peculiar in a brotherly kind of a way, you know? Horus is bigger than him, and he's also the first Primarch, the favored Primarch of the Emperor. So in a way, he's big bro in Sanguinius, and it's very cute to see. I know, you're gonna say, Warhammer's cute. It is, bitch, deal with it. Horus teases Sanguinius a little bit about, oh, hey, I had to bail you out, huh? Crazy, huh? And Sanguinius is very earnest and humble about it, and it really shows off his nobility, like his noble aspect. This interaction is enough to kind of shake the Mornival a little bit in seeing how human that Horus can be. Ultimately, no falling action or no plot happens because of this, but the book does take some time to give Loken's perspective about him seeing the Primarchs act in such a human, brotherly way. Eventually, after the greetings and salutations are had between Horus and Sanguinius, Horus invites Sanguinius to his personal cabin, his, private quarters, not the war room or anything like that. He just wants to go have some wine with his brother. We are left to assume that they have some kind of conversation, but it's like a closed doors kind of a thing. He doesn't even let the Mournival in. After this brotherly reunion has taken place, and after an adequate amount of time has been given to the Blood Angels Legion to fully get themselves up to speed with what's going on with the war, Horus and Sanguinius both join the battlefield, basically halving the time it would take for this whole thing to happen. Just something I want to mention is how much of a force multiplier the Primarchs are compared to the Space Marines. There's a meme in the Warhammer fandom about how one Space Marine is worth 10 Guardsmen, and there's feats and books and all kinds of stuff that kind of lend this to be more of like an info meme than it is just a straight deep fried meme, but the meme goes, one Space Marine is worth 10 Guardsmen, one Custodian is worth 15 Space Marines, and one Primarch is worth like 20 Custodians or something. Now, I'm sure I fucked up the numbers. If you're a real Warhammer fan and you're about to pull out all the feats and give me the whole 3-paragraph small short story about, oh, well, actually, the Custodian you're talking about, look, I get it. I'm not going to recall the numbers exactly, but there's like a hierarchy power scaling thing to this, right? That's all I'm trying to get at. Not only that, but you have to imagine that the Space Marines are going to fight harder when they're figurative and to a degree their literal dad is there cheering them on. They want to do good for them. It's like whenever you take your pee-wee son to his first baseball game, like we all remember our first sports game, right? Now imagine it's life or death. And yeah, I mean, everyone can somewhat relate to the stakes, right? You could have a little bit of sympathy for what they're going through. Well, cringe power scaling mental buff aspect aside, anyways, fast forward 6 months, the mega arachnids are basically extinct. There's like a couple pockets way deep in the mantle where even it's kind of tough for Space Marines to get to and survive, so they're trying to figure out a way to get those last few pockets. When, out of nowhere seemingly, a completely separate break-off human civilization from times of the old Galactic Empire make contact with the fleet, which caps off Part 2 of Book 1, Brotherhood in Spiderland. Now we're just going to jump right into Part 3, titled The Dreadful Sagittary. Because apparently Horus is a Sagittarius canonically, or some shit. Shout out Sagittarius, your boy's one of them. I won't betray you though, I promise. Anyways, back to the plot. The human civilization in question identify themselves as the Interrex, and they inform the Space Marine legions, namely Horus Lupercal, since he's the War Master in charge, that the mega arachnids they're attacking currently are actually, I guess you could say, prisoners of the Interrex, being banished on a prison planet for war crimes they committed on their first contact with the Interrex. With this new information provided to Horus, he completely calls off the campaign to exterminate the mega arachnids at the behest of the Interrex. While the Space Marine legions love fighting Xenos, and while the Imperium at large finds Xenos to be less than human, so not deserving the right to even live for the most part, Horus knows as War Master and under the expectations of the Emperor himself, his main goal in the Crusade is to unite the fragmented parts of humanity from the previous Galactic Empire, further demonstrating Horus's greater ambition that he's willing to give up on the basically already exterminated mega arachnids in pursuit of their jailers, the Interrex. Now, I know you're wondering, how the fuck did the Interrex just happen upon the fleet and the genocide that's taking place randomly? Well, as it turns out, it wasn't random. You remember those beacons, those weird satellite light show things that were going on that the Space Marine scientists just couldn't figure out? Turns out that was basically a global home alarm system / warning system combo. It just took the Interrex 6 months more or less to get here. When the Interrex demand an explanation as to how any human civilization can see a planet-bound insect hive mind species and just immediately think to exterminate it, Horus gets to give his whole spiel about the Imperium of Man, the Imperial Truth, putting humanity first, and all that great stuff. With the Interrex envoy not really having the authority to negotiate on behalf of the entire coalition, the envoy asks Horus if he would like to follow them back to the home planet of the Interrex, Zenobia. I hope you can already tell that Horus doesn't really like that, but he's willing to go talk to him and see if there could be a peaceful solution. As the negotiations with the Interrex main parliamentary body go on, Horus is shocked and frankly a little bit disgusted to see that humanity and Xenos races are just living in a cooperative governing body. As the discussions, debates, and proposals go on from both sides even longer, Horus also learns that humanity itself within the Interrex coalition government thing has actually genetically modified themselves to be more compatible with the Xenos as well, while also modifying themselves in their genome by adding and removing certain genes so that they have more desirable traits from the Xenos. Which makes sense, like any logical civilization would want to cooperate rather than conquer, right? I think now would be a good time to just hit the nail on the head and mention that the Emperor's whole, conquering everything ambition is kind of the exception and not the norm. Even knowing that the Interrex humans have violated the sanctity of their own humanity, Horus is still willing to work with them and try to get a peaceful solution to where they are subject to imperial rule and will pay taxes and just be a part of the fold and all that entails. Horus even goes so far as to have discussions and debate with the Mournival about whether or not they're worth saving, or it would be truly better to just conquer them, subjugate them, and then try to fix them in the Imperial way. And Abaddon and Little Horus Aximand obviously are going to sway in the side of conquering, which, to be fair, is a reasonable position to hold within the Imperium and at the highest levels of its leadership as well. However, Horus stands fast to his belief that he thinks that there is something to salvage from this in a peaceful way. But his main concern is that everyone in the legions just want to conquer these guys. They don't have the same big picture idea of conquering versus compliance versus the cost of doing either of those in mind in the same way that Horus does. He truly doesn't believe for a second that he has anything to worry about in regards to rogue elements that are just going to do terrorism and, oh, fuck it, I just want to kill these guys. He has faith that his legionnaires are disciplined and will follow his lead. He's mainly concerned with the impression that the legionnaires are going to be giving the Interrex, both on a civilian front, on a military front, just culturally, right? Because you have to keep in mind that the Astartes are just tools for war. It's nice that they want to keep their humanity like Loken and the way that the Warrior Lodge members do, but ultimately, a hammer is going to see everything as a nail. So in an attempt to placate the Mournival and explain his position even further to them, Horus views violence in the Great Crusade as a total failure on his part as War Master. He concedes that there are going to be certain Xenos races, like the Mega Arachnids, who you can only make room for humanity by exterminating outright. But he mentions 6319 as one of his most recent failures in the regard of political savviness and being able to negotiate a peaceful deal to integrate into the Imperium of Man. He even confides in Loken during the Mournival meeting how he deeply regrets Sejanus' death, and Loken is even a little bit surprised that he knew about Sejanus at all. And Horus then goes on to explain how all of his Space Marine Legionnaires are his children, and it truly shines a light on his humanity. Riding this emotional wave, he even tells a story about how the Emperor impressed upon him one night when they were looking at the stars how all that there is in the galaxy is ours to take, simply by the virtue of our own humanity. Eventually, after hearing all of Horus's arguments, the Mournival are swayed to trying to be as diplomatic and peaceful as possible. And this is the part of the story where we really get to learn more about chaos as well. We learn about it from Loken in his perspective during one of the diplomatic missions where he's escorting Horus. While Horus and one of the diplomatic envoys for the Interrex are talking behind closed doors, the envoys guard and Loken get to talking about their own experiences as warriors. Eventually, this tailed out into a conversation about chaos and their trepidation with dealing with the Imperium of Man because they thought they were tainted by chaos. Or just was chaos that was masquerading as humans themselves. We then learn from the guard that the Interrex had a run-in with one of the more ancient and warp-gifted races in the galaxy, the Eldar. And you could just consider Eldar as space elves who never die, but there's not a lot of them. They're just space elves, alright? But they're tricksters too. They're like tricky space elves. So when the Interrex made contact with the Eldar, they kind of got tricked into a short but very bloody war for the Interrex, where the Eldar wielded not chaos, but warp magic, because, you know, there's psychers who utilize the warp to make, like, what you would consider typical fantasy spells to be, like, lightning coming out of your fingers and shooting fireballs, but also shit that's way more chaotic and, like, eldritch by nature. So the Interrex are just a little bit traumatized when it comes to the warp travel, chaos, all that shit. And the guard expresses that the main reason he's kind of, quote, leaking all this information to Loken is so that it will get back to Horus, and that they'll understand that the reason that the negotiations have kind of been stalling out is because they're mainly worried that they are chaos or chaos tainted or whatever the hell. Now, this is all very shocking to Loken because he kind of knows what chaos is. Horus said specifically that there is no such thing as chaos in a sense of like godhood or spirituality, or I guess a more concise way of putting it would be like conscious, malicious intent, like evil incarnate type shit, where it's like, yeah, it is just evil because it is consciously being evil. But this guard is making a lot of sense, and he's telling him that, like, yeah, chaos is a real thing. It's not probably what you would traditionally consider to be like demons or the devil. There's not like one thing, but if you have some weird vibes going on, you're going to get corrupted by it. So just as Loken's putting all the pieces together and fully internalizing and coming to terms with the capital T truth he just learned, bang, boom, pow, explosions, gunfire, city alarms going off, something's going on, and the guard instinctively, because he doesn't 100% trust him, he just is hoping that his initial intuition about them being chaos influenced is wrong, completely flips out, starts spazzing, is like, I knew you were a traitor, and fucking starts fighting Loken. So Loken and this guard get to boxing, and it's a nice little fight, you know, like they're close enough that it's really just hands, but they're also far enough away that they have enough room to like move about. It's like a one-on-one true knockdown drag out fight. Eventually Loken gets the upper hand, but instead of dealing the fatal blow, he just decides to knock him out. Now that Loken isn't in any immediate danger, he can actually listen to what the alarm is saying, and he makes out that the war museum containing all of the chaos influence weapons that they held from the Eldar War has effectively been raided, and everyone's just assuming that it's the Space Marines, because why wouldn't you? So peace has gone out the window, and Horus is down here on the capital world of a multi-system hostile empire, no body armor, no weapons, just his Mournival buddies to keep him safe. I don't know if it's an attempt at self-preservation or if he's really living by the code that he set up in the Mournival meeting that we talked about earlier, but he attempts to arrange a ceasefire, and he comes out and he's trying to surrender, and then he gets shot a couple times, but that doesn't really affect him because he's a Primarch, right? But now peace is officially done with. The Mournival people are freaking the fuck out like his personal guard. They're like, oh, our Primarch's been shot. It's over. It's up. Like, the possibility of peace in of itself is completely off the table now. No one's going to make peace with someone who just shot their dad in front of them. Completely overridden by grief and knowing what they're going to have to do to this entire civilization, Horus crouches back into cover, grabbing his arm, no longer bleeding because he's a Primarch, but just grabbing his arm, experiencing the pain, feeling the grief, and with a single tear on his face, just calls for his Mournival guard to just go fucking get him. So fast forward like a day or something, right? They've been fighting on Zenobia for a while. They finally end up getting extracted out by the rest of the Legion, and Loken and the Mournival are told to, like, take some time, recuperate. You guys will go out in the next wave. Like, the war is officially on, you know? And during that recuperation time, he decides to tell the story to Mercedes Olatin, his remembrancer. Once Loken's done recounting the story to Mercedes Olatin, he states, after seeing the way Horus handled the situation and tried to make a ceasefire agreement in the heat of the moment, and with his information that he shared at the Mournival meeting, that he's never been more certain that the Emperor made the right call making Horus the War Master, which, as we all know, and we all will come to know deeply and intimately, is a statement that is just soaking wet with irony. The last thing we're left with in Book 1, Horus Rising, is the first chaplain, Erebus, from the World Eaters, a whole other Space Marine chapter that we're not going to cover right now because we're closing the episode, gripping tightly in his hand the anatheme, the chaos-crafted and chaos-imbued dagger that had the Interrex so up in arms about them stealing. Yup, gotcha, bitch. It wasn't an inside Kazebelli, it was actually all First Chaplain Erebus. We are going to have so much time to talk about First Chaplain Erebus, the Word-Bearer Legion at large, and especially their Primarch, Lorgar, the next time we cover Warhammer, and that'll be on Book 2 in the Horus Heresy, titled False Gods. Yeah, guys, Warhammer is fucking sick, and if you're not about it, then that's a big you problem. The universe, especially the Horus Heresy, has everything. It's got intrigue, espionage, battle, lore, drama, everything. Just not sex, but maybe sex, but probably not. I don't know, maybe. I'm only 20 books in, but hey, we're gonna get there when we get there. Overall, Horus Rising is a very good book. Look, I'm not going to glaze it as being a great book. I'm saying, like, if you take into consideration all the work it has to do to establish all the terminology, all the mythos, everything about the universe as like an entry point into the IP, it truly does a fantastic job. Now, do I think it's a great book, like, in of itself, like, the writing's good and all that other stuff? I'm just going to be honest with you guys. I don't read enough to know. But did I enjoy it? Yeah, I fucking did. You better believe it. Would have I enjoyed it as much had I had no knowledge of Warhammer at large and I was just like at the library and I was 12 and I got it? Probably. Overall, not scoring it against any of the other books. I don't think I'm going to score the books against each other. The rating I give it is just how much I enjoyed the story, the characters, the writing overall. If I tried to score the books against each other, I think we all know the top 5 that would float to the surface just because they're so densely packed with lore and plot movers as books. But waffling aside, I'm gonna give Horus Rising 9 out of 10. I think it grips you from the jump. There's plenty of great themes and underlying messaging and metaphor and allegory and all that shit, right? The book doesn't just feel like an information dump or like a glossary or dictionary for Warhammer terminology. and you get just enough of the bigger picture with Sanguinius and Lorgar's representative in Erebus being a part of the fleet that you kind of get to see enough of the universe and different perspectives of things from different characters that it makes the whole thing feel very fleshed out and organic in a way that most other media, even like visual media, kind of miss the balance on. A couple things I really enjoyed when I was first reading through it without any other knowledge, right? With my passing understanding and conceptualization of what Warhammer at large had to offer me. One, I really enjoy the way that they frame chaos and spirituality and all that, and how you can draw real, tangible power from it, but how it also can be used for your downfall. I mean, there's plenty of parallels to history and real world sentiment that we could draw from that. And that's one thing I love about Warhammer in general, is that it's just begging you to dig a little bit deeper in your own preconceptions and your own worldview. And the second thing I'd like to talk about has to do with the more practical side of things, and it's the price point, or we could say accessibility at large. Warhammer, like 40k, right? Warhammer 40k, not including fantasy, has literally hundreds of books. The Horus Heresy, I think like roughly it has like 80 books in it, I think. And Warhammer is always going on sale, at least the books are. Like, I get it through Audible, and there will always be Warhammer something. Maybe it's not the next book you need if you're trying to do like a read order like I'm doing with Horus Heresy. But even still, the price point for a 14-hour Audible audiobook is like less than $20, I think. I don't think I've ever spent more than $20 on one of my Warhammer books, which obviously is a good deal. Even if you're listening on 2x speed, like you're fucking tweaked out or something, you're still getting 8 hours or 6 to 8 hours of content for like $20. Compared to a movie, that is a fire-ass deal. Also, if you just catch Audible on their like audiobook day or whatever, it's like Prime, but for their actual media library. I got the whole Horus Heresy saga, minus the 20 books that I was already on, for like 10% of the regular value. I think I got the other 60 books for like under $200. So that's just something I wanted to highlight with Warhammer at large, is that if you're kind of broke, like if you're broke at the moment, if you're a college student, you're learning English, whatever the fuck, it's a pretty good way to get entertained for cheap. And just as a bonus point, because we're at the start of the series, right, I want to add that the Warhammer fandom is very even-keeled and always willing to help you. There's so many different aspects to the community itself. There's the tabletop game aspect of it, there's the fantasy aspect, the 40k aspect, the book aspect, the minis aspect, so much shit. If you're extremely brain rotted like I am, there's the whole power scaling debate about chaos, and you could, my dad could beat up your dad. You can argue about which Primarch's better. It's a very thriving, inviting community. So yeah, cheers guys, you made it to the end of the episode. Let me know what you think. Interact with it, whatever platform you're on. Drop a like, a comment, follow, do all the things. If you're interested in what I have to say, or basically release schedule announcements, follow me on X under the same name, @Effective Media. If you're listening to me on YouTube, go follow the Spotify channel. And if you're a Spotify only person, go show love to the YouTube. Both are under the same name that you're seeing on your screen, The Effective Media Show. I'm your host, Henry. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Let me know if you've got any thoughts, comments, concerns. I really do want to hear it. The whole reason I started the show was to get everyone's opinion on things, to talk about the things I love. Just please don't spoil me in the comments. Don't do it. Stay safe, have a wonderful day, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.